to Business Lessons from the Military. I'm your host, Kevin Bemel, and we are here every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific time to talk about military doctrine, military history, and the practices of great military leaders, and apply them to our business and professional lives so that we can have greater success. And also take advantage of the tremendous amount of resources that the military spends, both in terms of financial resources, but also the time that military people spend in being trained and learning these lessons and applying them in garrison and on the battlefield. So like to bring these to you. Always thought that this is a way for myself as a military veteran to, in some respects, return the support that my fellow citizens gave me and my military colleagues over the years. So today, kind of in honor of the upcoming Independence Day holiday, I decided I would tell a story about my father. It's one of my favorite stories that he told me as a boy growing up. And just as a little bit of background, so very early in my military career, when I was stationed on Okinawa, Japan, a chaplain colleague of mine asked me if I would speak to, of all things, the U.S. Army unit, I should say, that was there in Okinawa. Now, prior to him asking me this, I didn't even know there were any U.S. Army personnel in Okinawa. And strangely enough, they were running the port there, a job I would have thought the Navy was much better suited for. But in any event, I accepted the invitation and I told this story, and it went over very well, and I hopefully you'll see why. So the story dates back to the mid 1950s. My father was a recent college graduate. He had gone to college with a Naval Reserve Officer Training Corps scholarship at the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis. And now he was on active duty with the Navy, and he was assigned to a destroyer called the Fitch, and they were transiting the Atlantic Ocean and heading into the Mediterranean. Now, if you can appreciate, this is just roughly 8, 9, 10 years after World War II. So Europe is still rebuilding. And it was also a time when the formalities of society were much more common. So, for example, in daily wear, men wore at least a sports coat, if not a suit, and a hat, right? And my dad tells, this is not the gist of the story, but my dad tells a funny story about how the captain of his ship ordered his crew that when they were on liberty, that they and in civilian clothes, they still had to wear a hat, and they were these young sailors were incensed by that, but they had no choice because that's what the captain ordered. So, but nonetheless, so the ship was transiting, or was sailing in the Mediterranean off the coast of France, so southern France, and my dad was at the time that this story takes place. He was not on duty. He was not on watch, and so he was just kind of hanging out, I guess, outside the bridge of the ship, as he tells it. So he had a pretty good view of what was going on, but he had, no command responsibility because there was someone else had what's called the duty. He had the con, as we say in the Navy, and so my dad is just kind of hanging out up there. And as he's watching things progress, he sees that the ship is very likely to run down, of all things, a channel buoy. Now, that may sound like not a big deal, But at the time, I don't know if this is still the case, the French were very sensitive about their channel buoys being rung down. I guess it happened with some frequency. And while my dad didn't go so far as to say that running it down would have sparked an international incident, what it could have resulted in is the French saying, your sailors on that ship, you knocked down one of our channel buoys. You got to stay on the ship. You can't come have, liberty in southern France. And so thinking quickly, my dad ran down from the bridge, grabbed a couple of my dad, by the way, he was an officer at the time of this story. He was an ensign, I believe. And so he's a young officer, newly out of college and, on active duty. And so he grabbed a couple of sailors and they launched one of the ship's boats. And my dad's intention was to pull the buoy out of the way of the ship, because at the point where he noticed it, the ship was not going to be able to turn quickly enough to not run it down. That was the basic problem. And so they have one of these motorized launches, with the outboard motor on it, and they launch it and they speed off. And somehow, instead of, easing up to the buoy and moving it the way my dad intended, the boat rammed the buoy instead. And he basically stove in the boat. So, meanwhile, the officer who had watch on the bridge, or had the con of the ship on the bridge, I guess, sees this. He orders the ship to stop, and they fish my father and the two other sailors out of the water, along with the boat, which is now, has a big hole in it. Right. And, my needless to say, my father was scared. Right. I mean, he's new to the ship. He's new to the active duty Navy, and he's figuring, oh no, like I'm going to get thrown in the brig, basically. Right. The captain's going to put him in jail and confine him to bread and water or something like this. And, but anyway, they pull them out. So, the three of them go, they dry off, they put on, clean clothes, and the executive officer, it's the number 2 person on the ship, tells my dad that that he's to report to the captain's cabin, his office, basically. Right. And so, my dad is standing, he tells the story, he's standing outside the door of the captain's cabin at attention. The door is open. He can hear the captain and the executive officer talking about things unrelated to the situation my father was involved in. And they talk for a while, and my dad is sitting there, sweating it out. Right. And finally, the executive officer walks out into the passageway, what they call a P-way on the ship. Right. You can never say things, completely out. It's got to be an abbreviation. So he walks out of the P-way. He sees my dad standing there at attention, and he says, "Mr. Bemel, the captain will see you now." And so my dad, pivots, doing his best, marching, and he walks up to the captain's desk and he snaps to attention. He says, "Ensign Bemel reporting as ordered, sir." And the captain is sitting at his desk, and to set the scene a little bit, the captain of this destroyer was absolutely idolized by his crew. So he had started out in the Navy as an enlisted guy and had worked his way up. He was what was known at the time. You don't hear this phrase that much anymore, but he was called a Mustang, which means he was an officer who had started out as an enlisted man. And so he really knew what the plight of everybody on the ship was like. And, Navy life back in the 50s was not what it's like today. I mean, on some of these ships, you still literally slung a hammock. Now, I don't know if that was the case on the Fitch, but I mean, the conditions on shipboard were while they're not luxurious by any stretch of the imagination today, they were much less so, 75 years ago, or 70 years ago, I guess it would be closer to the mark. And so here's this. He was a Navy commander. He was that's an 05. It's one step below the Navy captain. The term captain it is used for the senior officer who's command of the ship, whatever his rank is. So you can have a lieutenant who's, captain of a, small boat, for example, or a lieutenant commander could be captain of a submarine, for example, like in World War II. That was not uncommon, right? So the captain is sitting at his desk, and my dad is in awe of this man, as is pretty much everybody on the ship. And so he's like I said, he snaps to attention and all that. And the captain says, "Oh, good, Mr. Bemel, please have a seat." And my dad is telling me this, the way he's telling me the story, he's mystified by this. And he's like, he's never heard of a sailor being chewed out while he was sitting, right? And he says to me, "Sir?" And the captain says, "Take a seat, Mr. Bemel, take a seat." Right? So my dad sits down, and the captain proceeds to ask him a whole bunch of questions, starting out with, "So, Mr. Bemel, tell me what happened." My dad describes the situation pretty much as I just described it to you. I saw the channel buoy. I knew the French were very sensitive about their channel buoys. And so I didn't think the ship was going to be able to steer out of the way. So I thought I would launch a boat, move the buoy over, keep it from getting damaged. And, and it unfortunately didn't go right. Right? He said, "So, how was it that you ended up, hitting the buoy instead of moving?" He says, "Well, sir, I guess in our excitement to, get out there and complete our mission, we were not paying careful enough attention, and so we ended up hitting it, or we misjudged the waves, or whatever it was." My dad never really told me exactly how he ended up hitting the buoy and staving in the boat, but he did. And the captain asked him question after question after question, going over the whole thing, and asked, "Well, what might you have done instead of, what you did?" And all these things. And he spent, I guess, I don't know, like an hour talking to my dad about this thing, which by the way, for the captain of a ship, and they're usually very busy, that's a long time to spend on something like this, right? And so he ends up asking, so the captain says to him, "Okay, well, very well, Mr. Bemel, carry on." My dad is sitting there, and he's like, "Carry on?" And the captain says, "Yes, sir, Mr. Bemel, you're excused." And so my dad stands up, and he, you don't salute indoors in the Navy. So he didn't salute the captain, but he kind of, came to attention for a moment, and he turns and he starts walking out of the captain's cabin. And you would have to know my dad. He had a way of telling stories that was just quite hilarious. And so he says, "I'm walking out." And he says, I can't believe that this is it. And so I just couldn't help myself. He said, "I stopped before I left the office, and I turned around and I said, 'Captain?'" And the captain looks and says, "Yes, Mr. Bemel." He said, "Sir, I don't understand." He said, I wrecked one of the ship's boats. I obviously didn't do the right thing." He said, "This is it. I'm not going to be punished." And the captain said, "Well, no, Mr. Bemel." He said, "No, not at all." And my dad is, "But I don't understand, sir. Why?" And he said, "Well, come back and sit down for a moment, Mr. Bemel." So my dad goes back and sits down, and the captain says, "There's a lot of things I can teach a sailor, but I cannot teach a sailor to take initiative. And you took initiative. Okay, it didn't exactly work out the way you had wanted it to work out. Well, that happens. And that's why we had this conversation. And I think if you take initiative, the next time you take initiative, it'll work out better." But he said, I I cannot teach a sailor to take initiative, and you did, and I want to encourage the members of my crew to take initiative, because I can't be here all the time telling them what to do. I need officers who will do that, who will get things done. And he said, so there's no point in punishing you. That's only going to subvert your initiative. My dad he's just, if he was in awe of the captain before, he is virtually worshiping him at this point. And he said, well, sir, I appreciate that very much. And the captain says, you're welcome, Mr. Bemel. He says, is it anything else? And he says, well, no, sir. And my dad gets up to go, and he said, and he says, my dad is walking at this time. The captain stopped. He says, one more thing, Mr. Bemel. My dad turns and he says, now keep in mind, I just spent the cost of a boat training you, so put the training to good use. I mean, obviously the guy had a sense of humor too, right? Who could not? I have to tell you, in all my years in the Navy, I never had a commanding officer quite like this man. I had some wonderful commanding officers that I worked with, some terrific men and women that I really enjoyed working with, but none who quite could meet this individual. And my dad like floated out of that office, right? He first of all, he couldn't believe his good fortune in having a commanding officer who would look at the situation that he looked at it. But afterwards, he really examined what the captain had said to him, and he realized how wise this man was. Indeed, when you think about it, it's almost impossible to train people to use initiative or to take the initiative. So I'm working on a situation right now where the former owner of a company has almost systematically beaten out of the staff any sense of taking any kind of initiative, and it's really terrible, because it's a company where a lot more could be accomplished if the people there had the self-confidence to take the initiative, and all I can do is assure them that if they do take the initiative, even if they make a mistake, I'm not going to clobber them, right? I really believe that the philosophy that the captain of my dad's ship had is exactly right. So while, of course, sometimes we have to punish people, if someone steals from us, no, we can't overlook that. That there has to be a punishment for that. We definitely want to, discourage that kind of behavior. And indeed, punishment is there to discourage behavior, right? Whether the punishment is, being fired, being suspended, something like that, right? Having that kind of negative consequence should be reserved only for things that happen that we don't want to happen again. Now, we need to be careful in examining that, because obviously the captain of the ship didn't want another boat stove in, okay? But that was the result of the primary action taken. The primary action taken was an attempt to solve a problem. And indeed, as ridiculous as it sounds, running over a channel buoy, a real problem for the ship, something that, as I mentioned a minute ago, could have meant that the entire crew would not have been allowed to have liberty in southern France. Okay, and that would have been a big hit to the morale of the crew. Keep in mind, they had just sailed across the Atlantic Ocean. That's, generally speaking, not a pleasure cruise on a destroyer. Okay, so we need, when we're dealing with things going wrong in our businesses, in our professional practices, one of the things we need to look at is, when something goes wrong, did it go wrong because something was happening that just should not have happened? I use theft because that's an obvious case. Or did something go wrong where the person who did the wrong thing was working to help the business out? They either made a mistake, or they misjudged the situation, or there were outside circumstances that caused their best intentions to go awry. And if that's the case, punishing that person is not only in not only not a good thing to do, it's actually completely counterproductive, because the next time that person has an opportunity to potentially drive our business forward, help us better meet the mission, they're going to hesitate to do that for fear that if something goes wrong, they're going to get punished again. Right? So this is the lesson that I took from this story that my dad told me, and it's a leadership lesson. Number one, obviously, because we're talking about the captain working with the sailor, but it's also a lesson for those of us who are dealing with leaders. So I was talking to a friend of mine last night who was describing to me a situation that happened to him on his job, working last week. And his supervisor didn't like something that happened, and I guess just totally went off on him, screaming at him. And after my friend told me, described the incident to me, I said, why do you think he did that? He said, I really don't know. I really don't know. And I said, well, it's completely counterproductive. I mean, you were not doing anything wrong. Basically, the supervisor was upset that things weren't getting done fast enough. Well, I don't see how screaming at somebody in the workplace is going to help them work more efficiently, faster, get things done more quickly. I just don't see how that's going to happen. They're doing their best, presumably, to get their work done as quickly as possible. Now, if we want to help people work faster, I think we're much better off sitting down with them and explain to them, gosh, we were thinking you were going to get this done more quickly. What has been impeding your progress? Let's talk this through. What can I do as a leader in order to help you work more efficiently or work more quickly, right? Because if we yell at the person may genuinely be doing their best, or they may feel, look, I'm giving it my best effort, and all I do is get yelled at. So there's no point in doing my best, because even when I do my best, I get yelled at. Well, that's counterproductive, right? So we as employees, or as service providers, as professionals, if we have a client yell at us, right, we also need to look at that and say, was the tongue lashing justified? Okay, now let me say, as a general principle, I don't believe in yelling no matter what the situation is. I don't believe in bad mouthing and flinging invective and all that kind of stuff. I just think in general that's counterproductive. But if I've done something wrong and a client is upset, and they express how upset they are to me over what happened, the first thing I have to ask is this legitimate? Okay, or are they? Do they have? Is what I did something that I shouldn't be doing or shouldn't have done? Okay, and that's important for us to recognize. Sometimes we as followers, or we as service providers, we need to look deeper into a situation before we respond. Because if someone treats us inappropriately and we just react to it and explode back on them, that's not going to help the situation at all. Whether we're a professional service provider, whether we're an employee in a company, and our supervisor gets on our case, yelling back at the supervisor probably isn't going to help the situation. However, if we keep our cool And we can explain to the supervisor why we think the supervisor's reaction is inappropriate. Okay, and we can do that diplomatically. We may advance ourselves much more so than we would ever think was possible. Okay, so both sides need to look at a situation where there's, where there's the I don't want to call it opportunity, the possibility of conflict. Okay, and look at what's really going on here. If there's some kind of punitive action taking place, is that really the way to solve the situation? And in particular, to prevent happening again what happened in this incident? Okay. And in doing so, are we going to prevent other good behaviors that we really want? Okay. So to take it back to the story, it's incredibly important for us to develop team members who will take initiative. And like I said a couple times already, it's I don't know that I agree 100% with the captain that it can't be taught, but it is incredibly difficult to instill in our team members the not the necessity, sort of the impetus to take initiative. Okay, that's something that we learn from our youngest years, and some of us learn it and some of us don't. Now, my dad taught me to take initiative, and interestingly enough, as I think back about my life, the times when I took initiative, even when things went wrong, those were not the times my dad got on my case. And in fact, generally, my dad only got on my case when my mom told him to. but he recognized that, like him, he wanted his son to know that taking initiative is a good thing. Now, obviously, we want to take initiative in a way that pushes the mission forward, that helps things out. But we cannot make a demand on our team members that says, take initiative and always have it work out well, because that's just not how life is. So we've got to be willing to accept that when our people take initiative, sometimes things are not going to work out the way we would like. And nonetheless, in order to keep their confidence and keep them taking the initiative, we're much better off evaluating what could have been done better next time rather than punishing them. And so that's the lesson that I want to impart to you today. This business lesson from the military, from my dad's time as a young ensign in the United States Navy. And when you think about it, as we head toward Independence Day, the celebration of the anniversary of the founding of our country, so we all need to take the initiative to make things better. And that's a one-on-one factor, like the captain with my dad. Okay, that it would have been even less appropriate for him to chew out my dad in front of other sailors. That is not the way we bring about positive change. The way we bring about positive change typically is through one-on-one interactions with our fellow citizens, our fellow Americans. We talk to them, understand them, engage with them. That's what the captain did with my dad. And it had a lifelong impact on my father. In fact, you could make the case the impact has lasted beyond his life, because here's his son, more than half a century later, relating this story to you. So this captain's legacy hopefully will go on and on and on. And when we emulate how he handled this, small crisis situation, and how he strengthened my dad as a leader, who in turn strengthened his son, me, as a leader, we can carry on that legacy forever. So I thank you for tuning in and listening to this story. It's a it's a particular pleasure for me to share with you the stories that my dad told me from time to time about his time in the Navy. Because, like I said, he's such a great storyteller. I have some other stories that I'll share with you on future episodes of the show. But I thank you very much for joining me. And before I sign off, so tomorrow on Wednesday at 10 a.m. is my show, People Making Money. And my topic is, I can't remember. Oh, yes. I'm going to be talking about how to prepare a realistic budget. So I don't know about you, but I really chafe against the idea of having a budget and having to stick with it. Nonetheless, it's an important thing for us to do to have financial success, to build wealth, to be able to stay on track professionally. And so I'm going to show you a very simple way to do it that I think will work. It has helped me, I will say that, and so hopefully it will help you. And so hopefully you will join me tomorrow. And if not, I do want to wish you a wonderful, meaningful Independence Day. And thank you again for joining me. And if you have any comments, thoughts, please share them in our social media. The links will be in the show notes after the show posts. Happy to respond to them. And signing off as I always do. Marie, darling, great person like my dad, you are my belle. Courage at all times, my friends.